The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another episode of Voices in Validation. This week, we have Chris Webble joining us. He's the principal of QACV Consulting. And I want to welcome you, Chris. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Stacey. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. I've been trying to get you on for a long time, so it finally happened. I'm appreciative.
Yeah, that's what happens
when you travel a lot, right?
Yes, I apologize for the time it's taken for us to get together like this.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I really do appreciate it. So this morning, I'm hoping that we can talk about computer systems validation. I know that that is one of your areas of expertise. And in the pharmaceutical industry, every drug, every product must go through stringent testing and prove to be safe and consistent before going to market. Obviously, patient safety is a major concern in the pharmaceutical industry. But I think what most people outside the industry may not realize is that there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes, such as validation of manufacturing equipment, processes, and then, of course, computer systems, both hardware and software. And that's what I wanted to focus on with you today, sort of the intricacies of CSV in the pharmaceutical industry. Before we dive in, though, I'm hoping you can just provide us with a brief overview of CSV and talk a little bit about why it's so important to the integrity of the product, the pharmaceutical product.
Sure, Stacey, I'd be happy to. So computerized systems validation has been incorporated within FDA regulation and international regulations as well for quite a while. There's more and more guidance that's come from the regulatory agencies, and also standard guidances that have come from industry as well that discuss various aspects of computerized system validation. And so I think when I first started getting involved in computer validation over almost 30 years ago now, there was very little. There were a lot of articles that were being published, and there were very few people that really had a good understanding. There were a lot of questions about what CSV actually meant and what it was used for. That's changed now because of organizations like IVT, and the regulatory agencies have created more guidance, and there's tons of information out there now on computerized system validation. And computerized system validation is important. If you look at the different systems that require validation, they're systems that are related to the manufacture of a drug product. They're related to the testing of drug product. They're used to document and trend safety events, product complaints, also quality management systems, so management of CAPAs and things like that. So there's a lot of uses for computerized systems, and really in today's day and age, we can't function as an organization without the use of these systems. CSV is important because without a validated system, if you're using an automated application, either for testing or manufacture, for example, you really don't have an assurance that that system is doing what it's supposed to do. And that's really what validation is. It's the intended use of demonstrating that the intended use of the system is working as expected. So if you are manufacturing a product and you don't have a validated system, then you may not be manufacturing product according to the manufacturing batch records, for example, or the set points, or the parameters that are important to demonstrate that the product has been manufactured correctly or according to the proper processes instructions. And back in the old days, the FDA would consider that computerized systems are really nothing more than automated SOPs. And if your SOPs are not current or accurate, then those you're not making product according to the expectations. The same for testing. So testing is most analytical tests use some form of laboratory software that's used to generate the data, to collect the data, and also to analyze the data. And again, if the results that you're getting for product testing are not accurate, you could be releasing, or a company could be releasing the product in a manner that's not doesn't meet specifications, or would be considered by the FDA adulterated product that does not meet its safety or efficacy standards. So it's very important, and validation is definitely something that all companies should implement robust programs to ensure, again, because it's the criticality of the product that we're giving to our parents, to our children, to our friends and loved ones. And if it's not product that's effective, then there could be safety issues that are associated with that product. So it's extremely important to the pharmaceutical industry and the integrity of data and of the products that we are all taking ourselves and our family and loved ones.
Absolutely. And I can imagine that the whole validation industry has had to shift. It's not just hardware and software or the processes for automation anymore. I imagine that really impact what the validity, the validation process. But there's all of these other factors in terms of where data is coming from, right? So the Internet of Things, a lot more things being connected to systems within manufacturing, outside of manufacturing. It could be a patient portal. It could be a lot of different things. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen validation processes change, or the requirements change as those things become more and more popular?
Yeah, well, I really don't think that the requirements for validation have changed too much over the years. I know that people have asked me what has changed between now and 20 years ago, and the requirements haven't changed. Validation is still required, and data integrity is still, it's a hot topic now, but it's always been required. And the things that really have changed have been all the new technologies and all the different tools and all the different methodologies that are being used for how software is developed, and how data is shared, and the data warehouses and so forth that are out there that help us to use data better, and for comparative purposes, or for all sorts of different reasons. So that's really what I think has changed. The requirements are still the same. You still need to validate systems. Now, what that means is maybe different based upon a risk-based approach to validation and scalable validation, so that we're not doing too much non-value-added activities, I like to call it, for validation, but we're doing enough to demonstrate and documenting enough to demonstrate that these systems are functioning as expected. And again, that's really what validation is: the intended use of the system, so that these systems are functioning as expected, and that they're controlling manufacturing equipment properly, and that they're generating accurate test results and things like that. There's a lot that goes to that, but really the requirements really haven't changed, and it's just we have so many different technologies and tools and uses for these systems now that the methodologies that we use, controls that we need to implement, may be different. We always needed controls for computerized systems, but the controls that we're using now, or that we're focusing on now, may be different than the controls that were implemented, that we were following 20 years ago. And that means because of systems such as the software as a service applications, where companies are relying more and more on software vendors to host their systems and the data that they collect and that they are using to support GXP activities, GMP, GLP, or GCP, and so forth. So there's a lot more to consider. The controls are still required. The controls are different, though, than what they used to be.
Okay. Fair enough. So, I mean, I understand that the requirements wouldn't change because you still obviously have to put patient safety first, right? So everything you do has to be to create the correct product. Talk to me a little bit about how the industry as a whole is starting to move to a paperless system or documentation system. I mean, that's typical. We see that across other industries. It's not a new concept, certainly. But in an industry like pharmaceutical, where they've relied so heavily on documentation and paper trails, so now going paperless, relying more on computer documentation, what impact, if any, is that having on pharma CSV processes?
I actually think that it makes the need for efficient and effective validation processes to be even more important, because instead of having paper records, we're really relying more on these electronic records that are generated or maintained by these computerized systems. So we have this data now that's electronic, and that's one of the reasons why the focus from the regulatory agencies on data integrity has come about. Data integrity has always been a requirement, and it's a hot topic now, but it's always been a requirement in the regulated industry. The FDA, for example, their mandate is to enforce is to ensure the safety of drug products or medical devices to the U.S. public. So that's what their mandate is. That's the only reason why the FDA exists. And the FDA enforces their mandate by doing periodic inspections of facilities and manufacturing facilities or research sites and so forth. And what they do when they come on to those sites to do their inspections is they review records and they review data. If those records or that data doesn't have integrity, or if they don't have integrity, then the FDA really can't fulfill their mandate. They can't do their inspections adequately because the data may be invalid for either because of lack of controls of systems or falsification, possibly, or other reasons. So the importance of having computerized systems validated and the appropriate controls placed on those systems now is even more important than ever, just because of the reliance on these systems and how they control quality, how they control manufacturing processes, how they control data that's being generated in the laboratory or other areas and so forth. So it's the importance of these systems is growing, not diminishing, and therefore the importance of validation and the associated data integrity controls is increasing as well, and it has been for quite a while. If you look at some of the regulations, the 21 CFR Part 11 regulation, which is
right.
electronic records, electronic signatures, there's a series of controls in 21 CFR Part 11.10 that are associated with the use of computerized systems. The first control within Part 11.10a, is validation of systems to ensure consistent intended performance and the ability to discern invalid and altered records. That's why we validate. That's why Part 11 is there. And again, it's important. It's critical for the FDA to be able to do their job and to ensure that we do have quality systems in place. And the quality systems are in place only to ensure that we can manufacture and test and release drug product or medical devices that are unadulterated, that they are effective, they're efficacious, and that they have they're safe for us to take.
Right, and thankfully that there is, that stringent type of regulatory rules and regulations, whatever, in place, because at the end of the day, I would think, pharmaceuticals are one of the things we as consumers take for granted, that it is correct, that everything has been, manufactured correctly, that it's been bottled correctly, that it's been kept on the shelf correctly, and that we don't know that that's actually the case, right? Unless these processes are in place.
Yeah, we rely on the drugs and the products that we buy and that we take and that we give to our children, our parents, and grandparents to be safe. We assume that, and that's because of the controls and the regulations that are implemented by the FDA and other regulatory agencies. That's why the FDA they take this seriously, and if a company has compliance issues, it's not because the FDA is being it's because they're being unrealistic. It's because these compliance issues may lead to the lack of controls that could result in adulterated product being released and drugs that are contaminated, drugs that may be degraded, drugs that may be too powerful or not strong enough to be used by the people that are taking those medicines.
Yeah, right. And you need to know that the intended use is actually, or the intended result is actually what you're going to get when you take that prescription. Chris, I've heard you mention data integrity many times during this conversation. Obviously, it's not a new concept. It's something that the pharmaceutical industry has always demanded. But we're also hearing a lot about big data analytics these days. So what are some current best practices that ensure security and still account for rapidly changing technologies?
Well, I think that it's with big data and data warehouses and the analysis of the data. I think of data integrity, again, it depends on what that data is being used for. But generally, if it's used to support trending or the safety or the manufacturer or the testing of products, then the data integrity controls still need to be applied. And so one of the things that I think is important is to really understand where that data is coming from. What's the source of that data? Is that data from a source that may have been validated, or are there controls in place to ensure that that data has validity? And then once that data is transferred from the source system or process, and how does it get to the data repository where there may be additional analysis or trending and so forth? So I think it's really important to. I'm a big proponent of data process maps to really have a full, strong, complete understanding of the data that's generated, the controls that are established when that data is generated, where it's stored, how it's stored, how it's also transferred to that data and also controlled to that data repository, and also controlled to ensure that the data is complete. So people aren't picking and choosing the data that is going to be used for decision making. It has to be complete data, and if it's not, then the data integrity principles, Alcoa principles, accurate and complete data, they're not being met. So again, having strong controls of each phase of the data lifecycle, from generation to storage to review approval, if there are edits or modifications to that data, to ensure that it's being tracked and maintained and that those edits are captured also within an audit trail, for example, and then also the transfer of that data to wherever it may go. If you think about clinical data, for example, that data comes from so many different sources in industry. So they come from clinical sites, they come from hospitals, they come from devices that patients enter data on their own for when they take their medicine, or if they have a fever, or surveys and so forth. It comes from laboratories that do testing, that send the results back to the principal investigator or to the sponsor that's sponsoring that study or that clinical trial. And all that data has to be collected. You really have to. There are digital images that are collected, that are analyzed from different imaging vendors and so forth. All that data has to be controlled, and all that data then is collected, analyzed by the pharmaceutical company, and then they are then submitting all that data from all those different sources as part of a regulatory submission to demonstrate that the drug is safe and that it's have some effectiveness, it's efficacious, and so forth. So without having those controls in place and understanding those processes, and again, I've seen a lot of problems with this. I do a lot of audits that are maybe for cause audits or investigative audits of these processes to see when there are problems, what's happened, what caused the problems, what's the impact of the study, and things like that. What's the impact on the data? And sometimes you may not, if there's a lack of control over some of the data collection processes, that data may not able to be used possibly in the regulatory submissions. That could be millions of dollars of work that is lost because of improper controls over the data that's collected to support a regulatory submission.
Right. And I totally understand that. And even though the controls are the controls, right? The expectations, you may change some of your controls, but even though validation has stayed the same over time, it seems like there are just so many additional moving parts. I wonder about validation teams in general. I mean, keeping up, maybe I'm wrong. It just seems like there's so many things that need to be watched nowadays because data is coming from everywhere at a rapid pace. Have you seen the way that teams need to handle processes or handle sites change over time, or would you say that that's still the same?
Well, I think that sometimes when you're focusing on specific data from a particular site, or if you're not looking at the whole picture, again, data process maps are really good use for this purpose to really fully understand where the data is coming from and so forth. So you can identify, there are risk registries that many companies have that identify systems or sites or processes that may be at a higher risk for data integrity issues possibly, or lack of control or lack of compliance in certain areas. So really I think where companies sometimes get into trouble is focusing on one particular area as opposed to really holistically understanding and being aware of all the data that's being generated and the controls associated with all that data. So I think that's something that individual validation teams that are working on a system, for example,
sure,
they may not be aware of the other processes that are being used to collect data or that may impact the systems that they're working on. So that's really an area that I think, well, there needs to be a program approach to ensuring that this data is being collected and there are controls in place for this data, and understanding the risks and focusing those resources on those risk areas.
So that's great to know. I actually didn't really realize there were risk registries out there being used. Are those, is that widespread usage? Like, is that an industry best practice now? I mean, I'm thinking especially as we move into this next industrial revolution, right, with the Internet of Things and AI and all of that, as we've alluded to a little bit in this conversation. Tools like the mapping that you mentioned and the risk registry seem like they would have to become a standard operating procedure for any pharmaceutical.
Well, I think risk registries are more common on the GCP side just because of the number of clinical sites and the different data sources and the different data collection processes. But a risk assessment is definitely something that should be utilized for. And again, a risk assessment based on the data process maps, I think, are really useful. But risk assessments of the data that's being collected and how it's being used and so forth, and the controls or lack of controls on that data, that's something that that can help focus a validation effort, or what I call e-systems compliance effort, to ensure that mitigation measures are implemented when those risks are identified. So risk registries, that's more common on the GCP realm, but risk assessments really should be used for all computerized systems to identify risks and not only identify the risks, but to mitigate the risks as well.
And for our users or listeners who may not be familiar with the type of mapping that do you have sample that we could include in the show note, a link to in the show notes, or is that really an individualized tool? Very dependent on the company.
Yeah, I can provide an example of what that looks like, but it is
Yeah, just an
dependent.
example.
Yeah, it
That'd be
is
great.
dependent. It's dependent upon the systems and the processes and so
Of
forth that are
course.
being used by each individual company or organization.
Of course. That would be great. Wow. So I learned a lot today, Chris, about the whole computerized systems validation and integrity. So I thank you for your knowledge. In parting, with your CSV hat on, give us a quick glimpse at this industry 12 months ago from now, and how you see where you see it going maybe 2 to 5 years from now.
Okay, that's a good question, and I really my focus over the last few years has changed from more from what you know the documentation is still very important, and user requirements and traceability matrices and specifications and testing and so forth. That's all still very important. My focus over the last few years has really gone back to the intended use of the system, and I say that computerized systems by themselves cannot be validated. You have to validate the computerized system within a process that uses the computerized system. So really, what is the intended use of the system within a process? And I think that that's something that I think is more valuable than maybe what has been done traditionally or in the past. But I think that I think companies should focus more on the risk of the intended use of the system. What happens if the system is not being used as intended? And I think that's a more value-added approach to validation. One example of that is I did an internal audit for a company recently, and that company they had some test cases. It was for a safety system, a drug safety system, and they had
Sure.
some test cases that were not able to be generated. And they, in their validation summary report, they were not able to complete the test steps for a couple of these test cases. And in their validation summary report, they stated that there's little impact on not completing these 3 steps for this one test case because um, because it was an insignificant number. And that was stated in the validation summary report as a deviation. But these test cases were actually 4 generation of safety reports that had to be submitted to the FDA. So the focus there was on validation test cases. That's important. But I asked, well, the intended use is that you have to send these uh, safety reports to the FDA
Right.
periodically. And if you can't generate them, there's no impact in the validation summary of how you what you're doing to meet that regulatory requirement or the intended use of the system. So I think there needs to be more of a focus on intended use as opposed to, again, all the other things are important, but the intended use is the most important. That's why we validate to make sure that these systems are used correctly and that they function correctly and that the data generated by the systems has integrity.
So would you say that you see that intended use standard that you're using become more widespread over the next few years? Or, I mean, is
I,
this something that's new? You said you're going back to it, but is this something that's kind of a new trend again? Or talk a little bit more about that.
I don't know that it's a new trend, but I think it's a more in-depth understanding of what's really important in these systems and validation. And even if you look at the data integrity guidance documents from MHRA and FDA, they talk about intended use. They don't talk about just they do say that testing is important and so forth, but without a system being used within that process that's intended to be used for, all you're really doing is testing the system. And one thing that I say when I give training at IVT courses and so forth is, it's not validation isn't what the system does. Validation is demonstrating that the system is doing what it's supposed to do, and that's really the concept. So testing is testing. Vendor supplied documentation is vendor supplied documentation, but it's really the user, the company that's using that system for their intended use that's responsible for validation, and you have to demonstrate that it's being used as intended.
Well said. Great way to end, Chris.
Thank you very
So
much.
for our listeners, obviously, if you are in this space, you need to make sure that your systems obviously are performing the way they are intended to perform. But Chris has more information on that. If you want to reach out specifically with questions, I think that's okay, Chris. We can include your email address.
That would be great.
In the show notes. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for our conversation. I know it could go on for much longer because this is such a big topic. And I'm hoping to have you back to speak on another topic again in a few weeks. But I do appreciate the time you spent with us this morning. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stacey.
Absolutely. Thank you again to Chris Wubbolt and our producer, Ed Sullivan, and Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends and colleagues. Now you can find out more about these podcasts and the IVT network by visiting ivtnetwork.com. And we look forward to bringing another great episode of Voices in Validation to you next week. Until then, take care.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.